Welcome back to another AP U.S. History lecture video. Today we're going to be taking a look at westward expansion that took place from the 1860s up until 1900. Don't get this mixed up with Manifest Destiny. In many ways this is sort of like an extension of Manifest Destiny, but it comes after the Manifest Destiny period in the 1830s and 1840s. So in other words, to understand westward expansion, we really have to go to the 1860s during the Civil War, when Lincoln was attempting to create a national economy. Remember, he had established the Homestead Acts of 1862, which gave incentives for people to move out to the West, and if they settled on the land for 10 years, they could buy it for pretty cheap. Also, Lincoln had provided grants to the transcontinental railroads to try and develop a national market system. So, small problem, there were huge native populations, about 150,000 people. By the time that this process would be done, would dwindle down to just 20,000 people. Now, one of the big things we have to keep in the back of our mind is that westward expansion during this time has really been created into sort of like mythology, and that was created in the late 1800s by rodeos, minstrel shows, and circuses that gave us what we remember a lot of times as being like the cowboys and the Indians of the Old West. That really is a portrayal much more of those shows than the reality. The reality really was a movement of natives off their lands so that a national market system could be created. The creation then of cowboys, yes, but cowboys herding cattle for the beef market, and then a recreation of this new market system with the Transcontinental Railroad. Conflicts with the native tribes first off. I think it's so important to remember that there really is no such thing as a Native American. Rather, there were hundreds, literally hundreds, of different Native American tribes that were spread out across the country and were recognized by the federal government. The problem was the American federal government really wanted to move people out west for farming, cattle, and gold. I'll give you an example of this. This one was not really done by the federal government itself, but it demonstrates the American mindset of movement, and that's the creation of the Mormon religion. In many ways, the Mormon religion was really distinctly American in the sense that it was a group of people out on the East Coast who had a certain set of beliefs that were really questioned by a lot of people in that area. And so the Mormons left in order to escape so-called exploitation and then moved out to the frontier and eventually settled in Utah, where they believed that they had found this new Jerusalem for themselves. This is sort of like the stereotypical mythology that Americans had. This led into a whole bunch of native wars, and I'm going to give you a few examples of this taking place. Let's start off with the first one in 1862. American settlers had grown at the time from 6,000 to 150,000 over 10 years. There were 4 men from a particular tribe called the Santee tribe who killed 5 white settlers as this expansion was taking place, and it led to a major battle at a place called Wood Lake. The American militia won at this battle, ending what was the Sioux Uprising. 2,000 Sioux were taken as prisoner and then condemned to die. Abraham Lincoln, who was still president at the time, commuted all of these sentences except for 38. Those 38 were eventually executed for those murders. The Sioux feared losing their land, and that led to a treaty called the Treaty of Laramie, in which the Sioux Indian were allowed to keep their land, but there would be a secured right of passage for Americans through the Sioux land. Seems like a pretty good compromise, except settlers found gold in Colorado. And this seems to be the pattern. Whenever especially gold is found at the time, this leads the federal government to want to come in and take over the area. And there are a few different reasons why. Probably the most important is that gold at the time was used to back up currency. So the Cheyenne Indians who lived in the area were split over this treaty, and a local white militia leader named Chivington attacked and killed 200 men, women, and children at Fort Lyon at Sandy Creek. This eventually led to the creation of a new Indian Peace Commission in 1868 that tried to resolve some of these problems. However, the Native Americans in the area and the military tended to disagree over the terms, and that began a new war called the Red River War. The military at the time said, at this point, we got to move Indians onto reservation systems, and by 1874, if they weren't, they were going to be rounded up. So in 1874, Americans were placing more and more of these Native Americans onto these reservations, and lo and behold, yes, Gold was found again, this time in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. General Philip Sheridan moved in his troops in order to try to get a hold of that area and the gold. One of the most famous of these is General George Custer, who believed that he could go in with the 7th Cavalry and take over the area. He was warned not to do this. He was told if he went in, he would be surrounded, but he operated under that sort of like assumption that these barbaric natives would not be able to fight back against him. Well, he went into the area and he was tricked into going into a large valley in which he believed that was where the Native American tribes were, and there was a whole tent tribal community set up there, but they had actually tricked him to go into that area. They had surrounded him in the hills around him, and then they came riding down, and they were able to surround him, and it got rid of his entire 7th Cavalry, including George Custer. This led to the Sioux Wars that were led on the Indian side by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Another example, the Navajo in the Southwest. In 1862, General James Carleton wanted to place them, 10,000 of them, on a reservation. He had Colonel Kit Carson march them onto reservations. They were forced into the Bosque Redondo, a horrible area that just led to disease and death, and eventually led to the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, in which the Navajo were allowed to eventually go back to their land. The purpose for all of this really was to expand for industry, agriculture, and for settlers. For example, this time period there was these new transcontinental railroads. Probably the most famous was the creation of the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific in 1862. And as both sides, the East Coast and the West Coast, were working on this, Chinese labor became extremely important on the West Coast. Some Irish immigrants at the time who had settled on the East Coast and had been working on the railroad went to look for new jobs on the West Coast. And there was one particular man who became their leader, a man named Dennis Kearney here in California, who came over with the Irish to California and then saw that there were no jobs left. And the reason why was the Chinese who had come over had built the railroads in the area. Dennis Kearney got extremely upset about this and began leading a nativist movement against the Chinese. Now, think about how ironic that is. On the East Coast, the Irish were oftentimes stereotyped as un-American and unable to be American because of their Catholic background. Here now, Dennis Kearney, an Irishman, was leading a fight against the Chinese, the underlying issue, a fight over jobs. In fact, there were a number of Chinese towns here in California, in Los Angeles and San Francisco. The Irish would actually come into them late at night, and they would burn houses down, lynch Chinese people. And eventually it led to a movement here in California and then nationally for what was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically kept any new Chinese people from coming into California or into the United States. And by the way, that would be extended all the way out to the 1960s. So this was also a time in which we saw the creation of the cowboy drives of the 1860s and 1870s. The cowboys of this time period, unlike the mythology we get from rodeos and from carnivals, cowboys were basically just normal, regular people who out on the Midwest would herd cattle and bring them up to the Great Lakes area. Cattle were then shipped from there either by the Great Lakes or by railroad over to the East Coast, where they would be slaughtered and then sold for international trade. Now, cowboys actually included 1/4 of them were African Americans, and many more were what were called Mexican vaqueros, or cowboys. So in the end, this led to an attempt to try to assimilate Native Americans. And the best example of this was in 1887 under the Dawes General Allotment Act. There was an attempt by Protestant Americans at the time to transform Native Americans into being more like white Americans. So that meant that they should lead their families in a patriarchal way, that they should be single-family farms, and that they would eliminate collective communal decisions, which was very typical of the Native American culture. In response to this, a man named Wovoka created what's called the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance was an attempt by Wovoka, and he claimed this to his people, that if they did this, he would awaken the ancestors, and the ancestors would come and protect the Sioux Indian. In South Dakota, which had just become a state, the leader of the previous Sioux Wars, Sitting Bull, was killed in 1890. And when this happened, there was this sort of like uprising amongst the natives in this area that they believed that this new ghost dance would protect them. So the American cavalry intercepted a band of these Lakota, 350 of them, and brought them to a place called Wounded Knee, where they attempted to disarm them. And when they did, there was this one man who was deaf, and when they went to go get his gun, he didn't understand what they were doing. There was a confusion that happened over this, and somebody ended up firing. By the time this was done, over 150 men, women, and children were massacred on the Native American side. In the end, this leads to a very important hypothesis. And the argument was made by a man named Turner. Turner was a graduate student at the time. He wrote a thesis called what's been called now Turner's Frontier Hypothesis. He argued that the American expansion was all about civilization, and that this was about the American character. That the American character was about going out to the West and taming the West, and that is what made us into rugged individualists. However, he was looking at the Census Bureau in 1890 and realized that that frontier was starting to close, and he feared the loss of the American character. Where are we going to get that ability to tame ourselves in the long-term future? Okay, a couple of things that are important there. Number one, it's a huge assumption. The assumption is that there was no civilization out on the frontier. In fact, all these natives were not civilized. That was what Americans brought to the frontier. Second big thing is the conclusion that comes out of this. If the frontier at home is closed, then where do we go? Well, probably we're going to have to go overseas. And that's going to get into our next unit about American imperialism. Okay, so what are our big takeaways? There are three of them, as usual. First up, expansion to the west meant moving natives onto a reservation system. But these reservations were always open to restrictions, and really for the federal government, it was largely about transcontinental railroads, farming, and gold discoveries. Number two, the transcontinental railroad system helped to create a national market-based system that unified the country economically. But oftentimes, it gave rise to new labor and ethnic tensions, like what happened between the Irish and the Chinese. And then last off, the end of the century was really one of fear, in which Americans feared they were going to lose their rugged individual identity once the frontier closed. But that really comes out of the cowboy mythology. It's not so sure that that's completely accurate to what was going on at the time. Okay, see you in class.